So we'll begin by setting our motivation. So we recollect our intention to study the Lamrim, the teachings of the Buddha, as presented by great masters like Lama Tsongkhapa, the condensed, extracted, highest meaning of the Buddha's teachings. And we study them because they present to us a reliable, easily followed, powerful path to unlocking our potential, showing us how to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha and achieve the awakened state for oneself. And they have that power because the Buddha and his teachings and the community of practitioners who understand those teachings on a very deep level are all respectively, individually, true sources of refuge, protection. And the purpose of engaging in that process is not for one's own benefit alone, but to become of benefit. So we generate these minds of confidence or faith and refuge in bodhicitta. All right. So we went up through day 254, last class, finishing the 5 factors that stimulate the arising of afflictions, and then talking about the extremes of attachment and aversion. So, any thoughts or questions about what's been covered? We can start then with day 255. And here this is a bit more of a general teaching from Lama Zopa, because we've been looking at, in this broad section, on cultivating the wish to definitely emerge from suffering, or renunciation. We've looked at all of the disadvantages of not cultivating that by remaining within ordinary cyclic existence and the sufferings that we would therefore be subject to. And then we've also been looking at why is it? What are the causes of cyclic existence? What is the engine that drives? It's, if we look back to the Four Noble Truths, we are not in a causeless suffering state. There are reasons why cyclic existence comes into being. And so we've looked in the later section on those factors, essentially the afflictions that are present in the mind, that arise with the mind naturally and spontaneously. And Lama Zopa is suggesting that that be what we focus our attention on, that that is what we blame for our troubles. That and actually I kind of had that thought earlier today, because there's been some vandalism in some of the spaces where I live, and they're putting the people who run that are kind of decided that that's the responsibility of the people to just pay money and like install additional security measures and things, rather than like we're already paying money to live there. And they're not really kind of saying, well, so it was a little bit difficult of a situation, having being put into this, where I'm being told, well, you have to fix this, you have to pay. And I was like, well, what am I'm already paying dues and things, and thinking that they're going to use that collective money to provide some security. But then, so I was kind of going down that rabbit hole, and I was like, well, but, why is it that I live in a place, that where that's happening? There's many places where that isn't happening, and, I could live in one of those places, but I don't, and that's my karmic ripening, is that, well, that's what is happening to me. And so if I had different karma, I'd be having a different experience. And so and just sort of that way of thinking has many advantages. One is that, as I mentioned, it kind of cuts off that spiraling that we can, instead of, like, well, you are not engaging in the right action that would make things easier perhaps for me. And that's that sort of externalization that we go through. But then also it fuels this wish to definitely emerge from suffering, by recognizing, well, for one, of course, it is a particular karmic appearance for myself, but also it's not that uncommon in general. Anywhere in the world, people are subject to vandalism, to burglaries, and it's because of all pervasive suffering, in a way. No matter where you go, there are shortcomings, there are disadvantages. And so unless and until we actually achieve enlightenment, these sorts of things are what we should expect. We can't expect anything other than that from cyclic existence. That's all it can offer us, is unsatisfactory experiences. Some of them are better than others, but none of them are fully satisfactory. And the reason that we are yet again experiencing that is because the delusions exist in our individual mental continuums. So he says, we need to put all of that blame not on this person not doing what I want or seeing it the way that I see it, but rather in my own mental continuum, there are these afflictions, and I'm the only one that can do anything about that. And apparently, I haven't so far. I've only made a certain amount of progress. And so I have to make more progress. I have to continue to make effort. I made progress in past lives, or we wouldn't have such a fortunate rebirth, relatively speaking, but we haven't gone all the way. We've not fully finished that task. And so that's our job, is to, in terms of the Lojong trainings, they would say drive all blames into one. You put all of the blame into the self-cherishing mind, the self-grasping mind, fundamental ignorance, and then the cascade of individual afflictions that flow from these faults that are in the mind. He says without delusions, or afflictions, problems wouldn't happen. Like I was saying, if my mind was completely free of delusions, then I wouldn't experience any problems, and I wouldn't, even if something challenging happened, you wouldn't even begin going down that sort of. You would just be like, oh, this is an extraordinary opportunity to practice, to see, instead of like half an hour after, kind of, then you sort of course correct. That's good. But we could certainly, we can make progress. He says, as long as we harbor the seeds of delusion in our mind, delusions will always plague us, rob us of happiness, cause us to endure suffering, and keep us away from complete freedom and enlightenment. He says, if we could really see the suffering that our delusions have caused over countless lifetimes, then we would think of nothing else except destroying them. Even the Buddhas cannot fathom the extent of the sufferings that our delusions have caused us. Because there's that story, of course, where the Buddha was asked, what's the origin of cyclic existence? And the Buddha said, as far back as I can possibly see, there has only ever been cyclic existence. There's never been anything other, for ordinary sentient beings whose minds are afflicted. There is no origin. So even the Buddha can't say, well, it's been this many number of lifetimes of suffering. It's beginningless. Even they can't find the origin. So this is, again, that other definition in a way of renunciation is the wish to definitely emerge from suffering. So this is that definition, that way of thinking about it, brings in this sense of resolve that Lama Zopa here is addressing, this kind of unshakable determination. I will definitely emerge from suffering. And the only way to do that is to stop creating the causes of suffering, to overcome the things that are responsible for our suffering. It's just the fact that the delusions exist in the mind. Any thoughts or questions so far?
Mm-hmm. Would those be, like, I'm just thinking of the tale of the Buddha when he's finally sitting down to enlightenment and all these arrows are coming at him and they just fall away. It's like he's no longer, are those pretty much, would those be the same as the afflictions or delusions?
So I mean, the story of his final enlightenment, it's in one way, it kind of depends on the school of thought that you're addressing, because that particular story gives the impression that the Buddha actually progressed through the path in, as Siddhartha, and then, arose and so on. And that is accepted by some schools of Buddhist thought, but not all schools of Buddhist thought. In the Mahayana tradition, they hold the view that Siddhartha, the birth name of the person who would become the Buddha, the one who is awake, that his mind was enlightened at some point in the past, and that he chose this particular incarnation. He chose to emanate into the world as a wheel-turning Buddha for the benefit of our planet. But that story then, may not be, it could be, an example still of what at some point, would have happened, which is, because there's kind of different stages to that story in terms of kind of all of the things that were kind of being thrown, you said, but all of the different, desire, energy, anger, all, basically, yes, like all of the different afflictions. And the Buddha kind of showed the aspect of generating the antidotes, and his antidotes were so unshakable and so effective that they demonstrated that even when that energy might initially arise, that it could be there for a second or a millisecond, but then it can be completely destroyed by bringing up the afflictions, or bringing up the antidotes to the afflictions. From the Tibetan point of view, you can't achieve enlightenment without mastering the Vajrayana teachings, and that, in particular, of course. So, a person would have to do that in order to achieve full enlightenment, and that's not, that particular story is, I think, probably in the Pali Canon, so which is why it's accepted by, it's canonical in every Buddhist tradition, but some traditions would hold it to be, sort of not to be interpretable rather than definitive, to be sort of something that teaches an important part of the path. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? So in day 256, Lama Zopa is now going to give us sort of a method or a strategy for working on the mind, which is something that's come up again and again throughout all of the different sections, the importance of cultivating introspective awareness, mindfulness, in order to catch the arising of the afflictions as quickly as possible. So in order to, because, eventually, with long training and so on, we get better and better at moving the mind away from the arising of afflicted states. Sometimes it's really powerful, and it isn't until maybe later that day when we recognize that we really lost our mindfulness in that, because some very powerful trigger was present. And so then, but even later, like, okay, that's that's what happened, and that's where we are on that day. So it's a perfect opportunity to do a meditation where you think about what would have been a better, a better way to think, better words to say, a better way to have held the mind during that experience. And then you just pretend that that's what you did. And in so doing, you familiarize your mind with a more constructive way of having done that, even though it's purely imaginative at that point. But still, you know, even a neuroscientist will tell you that even if we just think about the brain, that the brain doesn't distinguish between something happening in physical reality and something happening in the mind. So, when that's why, our dreams, we wake up and we're sweating, and because we're reacting as if it really happened, the fear or the whatever, even though it's purely imagined. And when we think about food, we start salivating as if it was in front of us, as if we could actually smell it, even though we're just imagining it. So imagination is very, very powerful, in terms of training, which is one of the whole premises of meditation. It's all in the imagination in a way, but the mind doesn't really prefer, doesn't say, well, this is real and this is imagined, except in terms of like physical pain. We can't really, but you can remember very vividly, even physical pain, a bad headache, or, I mean, you can get an approximation of it in your mind. Um, so, uh, so that's, even if that's kind of like worst case scenario, right? Like the event totally happened, you said or did whatever you said or did, and there's no chance except to take that as an opportunity to imagine that it went differently and use that as a way of creating a new familiarity, a new habit. But over time, by trying to, through a meditation practice and through cultivating uh, introspective awareness and really strengthening that as a skill, then it becomes more and more feasible to move that needle back, further. And even quite soon after the the thought that we can identify as being anger or being attachment, or and sometimes even just the agitation is there in the mind, just a sense of unease becomes, comes into the mind, and that is a cue. That can be a cue, to pull the mind back into a more constructive way of thinking about whatever is happening. But he says if we never cultivate that skill, then we never have any hope, of ever kind of pushing that set point back, further and further. So, he's saying that's really important, that we can avert, we can choose not to go down that cascade of stories and that cascade of thoughts, at some point, and then we can, the next day, the next week, the next month, that point is a few seconds better than it was, and so on. But if we don't, if we go back to the previous contemplation, if we don't have that strong, clear recognition that it is the afflictions that are my enemy, that it is what is disturbing the mind, then this introspective awareness won't become so important. It won't seem like such a useful thing to develop, because we're going to fall back on the strategy of, bullying, or trying to get our way, trying to manipulate the situation, trying to say, well, you know, no, I'm going to sue you for not providing, not providing the kind of security in the building that I think you should. So I'm going to take you to court. I refuse to do anything about this. I'm going to, and then making this whole production, that's a strategy. We can try, and some people, find that kind of they get their way. People are afraid of them. People are intimidated by that kind of way of being in the world. And so maybe they're pretty successful, but then they die. And then what? What did they spend their life cultivating? Even if they generally got their way for most of, their whole life by kind of being a bully and kind of trying to be aggressive in order to get what is more comfortable, because to them, people who don't say or do what makes them comfortable, that's the enemy. That's what needs to be controlled. That's what needs to be altered. And that's certainly much easier than trying to actually affect the states of mind that are arising, kind of naturally and spontaneously, that have eons of habit pattern, behind them, and that force. That's certainly a much more difficult job than just trying to force other people to kind of agree with how we see things and to do what we would like. But so it depends on what kind of skill we want to develop. Do we want to become really good at manipulating and bullying, or do we want to go inward and become really skilled at excising the delusions?
Venerable, does the act of imagination or reimagining a situation have any impact on purification, or is that a totally separate idea?
Well, so I mean, I think in terms of, if we think about purification from the standpoint, because one of the functions of purification, if we think about like resolve, for example, if we think about the four opponent powers, one of the critical functions of purification practice is to try to use that sense of resolve, combined then with mindfulness, of course, introspective awareness, after, for whatever length of time. Maybe we said a day, or we said 6 hours, or something, depending on what we're working with. And we said, okay, I'm going to work. My coworker is this particular coworker is really pushing my buttons, but today, I'm really going to make an effort to not say something unkind like I did yesterday, right? So that, and then following through on that resolve, that determination with introspective awareness, even if we weren't totally successful, even if we made it through the first 5 or 6 things that they did that frustrated us, and we really did, but when we got to the 9th thing that they did that frustrated us, we slipped a little bit, and still that's improvement. But yesterday, and then we try, and so then we purify it again that night, and then the next day maybe we get to 7 things, and so on. So given that relationship between resolve and introspective awareness, the imaginative meditation that doesn't, wouldn't have had the other any of the specific factors of necessarily, maybe some of them, but maybe not. Like maybe it could have some regret or something, but certainly it doesn't have like necessarily visualizing Vajrasattva or the mantra or 35 confession Buddhas or any of that. Still, though, like any meditation, it's going to create a greater familiarity. And it's going to create greater familiarity with that which is antidotal to the affliction. So patience or loving kindness or what have you. So we're strengthening an antidotal habit pattern, maybe independently of what you would call purification, but still like resolve, like the factor of resolve and introspective awareness. It certainly helps to make us more into someone who's less likely to give in to that affliction, because we've energized loving kindness, we've energized patience, we've energized whatever it is. And so simply by having done that, when that triggering stimulus arises, we've made it more likely that that particular antidote is going to be what we'll slip into, simply because of the force of that habit.
Thank you.
So he says mindfulness or introspective awareness is the most important tool we have to guard our mind and make sure that we never create non-virtue. We need it to be constantly present, always watching and checking what the rest of the mind is doing. Whenever any non-virtuous thought arises, we need mindfulness to identify it immediately and give ourselves the opportunity of averting it. We need the mind of introspection to be there, standing like a guard at the door of a house, constantly alert, watching for any thief that might try to sneak past and steal the treasures inside. The treasure is our happiness, and the delusions are the thief. Okay. So with day 257, he's again giving us some more tools, kind of pulling together the various parts of the path, because we are technically on the middle scope here. So in theory, we have a lot of mastery over the small scope, or at least a lot of familiarity with the small scope. So he brings in the idea of karma, which is a small scope meditation or topic of wisdom. And so, he's talking about that karma, although it means action, it specifically means the not a physical action or a verbal action, or even the mental action that we would label as a particular virtue or non-virtue, like covetousness, but it's the intention that gives rise to covetousness or ill will or love or compassion, the thing that precedes even what you could label as a particular afflicted state. He says, wherever there is mind, there is intention. Before any action, there must be a motivation or intention. Otherwise, there'd be no energy for the mind to act, which is what we talked about, a couple of contemplations ago when we were distinguishing between wholesome and unwholesome desire. The desire to be of benefit, the desire. Because if we don't identify enlightenment as something that we don't have and that we would like to have, nothing will ever happen that will move us closer to enlightenment. And if we don't identify the delusions as something that we do have and that's something that we would like to have less of, nothing will ever motivate us to move away from the afflictions. So motivation or intention, can be wholesome or unwholesome. It can spur us toward a virtuous goal or a non-virtuous goal. And then he says, the initial intention is called the motivation or of cause, and the intention, that is the energy behind completing the act, is the motivation of time, the intended karma. So intended karma means, like, as we said back when we were talking, in the module or the topic on karma, the thing that we choose to do is really just a means to actualize that intention. It doesn't, the intention when we see a cockroach, and it's the intention that we've generated in the mind to take its life rather than to take it outside, then at that point, whether we poison it or whether we, stomp on it, or whether we, vacuum it up and, kind of rip its body apart through suction, or, doesn't matter. The particular means, those were all just intended, that was the intended karma, but it was just, this is what I had available to me to actualize my mental intention of wanting to take its life. Similarly, if we want to protect its life, doesn't matter if we get a plate or we get a cup or we, scoop it up, from one hand into the other hand, or the intention, all of those are just means of, and it gets even, more complicated and more broad when the motivation is less specific. The motivation might just be like, I'm bored and I want to not be bored. Then we might make a phone call, we might eat something, we might go for a walk, we might play some music, we might paint something, we might read a book. Doesn't matter, the motivate. I mean, it can, like if we, do something, it certainly can matter in the sense that we might pick something that's more or less wholesome. Some people alleviate boredom in maybe more destructive ways than other people, but it's still, I'm trying to, what was happening in the mind was a sense of restlessness, a sense of dissatisfaction, and I wasn't able to tolerate working through that, whatever was arising, trying to apply some sort of antidote, trying to, watch the evolution of that quietly without engaging in action, to kind of see if that energy would sort of dissipate on its own. The energy arose, the dissatisfaction arose, and so I searched my environment and I picked, the food, the phone call, the movie, whatever, to do something about this state that was agitating me, that would be the intended karma or the intended action. But its goal, whether it is a phone call or whether it is a movie or whether it is food, its goal was to make the agitation in the mind stop, to make the sense of dissatisfaction or not being able to tolerate the present moment be something other than what it is. He says, for an action to be as pure as possible, we need to ensure that we not only have the best possible motivation beforehand, but also while we are carrying it out. In that way, what we do becomes very powerful, positive karma. If we don't check our motivation both before and during the action, what starts out as virtue can become non-virtue. In that case, we still have created positive karma with our initial motivation, but the motivation of time is negative, and therefore the action is not completely perfect. So an example of something like this could be, seeing some sort of need, something that somebody wants help with or needs help with, and then just initially kind of saying, oh, seems like they're struggling. I should help in some way. But then, and that's quite good. That's nothing wrong with that. But if we don't kind of hold on to that and kind of keep that in the mind, then as we're engaging in the action, it can turn into, why didn't they say thank you? Why don't they seem grateful that I helped them? Or this other person over here, they're looking, and I hope that I impressed them. I hope that they see that I did such a nice thing for this other person that maybe we both know. I hope that I've changed their opinion of me in some way. These, because the energy of self-grasping and self-cherishing and all of the afflictions are so strong, what started off, really positively can get co-opted, can get impacted by that sort of the lack of the strength of our mindfulness that didn't glom on to that really positive motivation and just not let it slip in the mind. We kind of got busy, we started doing it, the mind's a little bit more active now, there's things happening, the body's doing stuff, and so we just sort of lose that intensity, that focus. And at that moment, these self-grasping, self-cherishing thoughts, they can start arising. And of course, still, it's not too late to apply an antidote to that and try to, again, move the mind back. But we might just start sort of going with that new flow. And to the extent that any of that's happening, we can say, yeah, it was great that that initial motivation was good, but it wasn't fully carried through. Or in the same way, we might think, oh, I can just pick up this cockroach or something, but then it starts to wriggle, it starts to gross us out, and then we kill it, because we couldn't fully engage in that all the way through. We couldn't hold the mind in the purity of that motivation. So it's important to not think only of the causal motivation, but then also to think when we're picking the action, when we're engaging in whatever it is that's meant to correspond to that causal motivation, that we still think about how incredibly important it is to maintain a really consistent, positive thread of thought all the way until the action's finished, until it's over with and done.
Venerable, I have a question. What are the karmic repercussions of, for example, here, a couple of our buildings that we have here have had infestations of carpenter ants. I know of no way to get rid of carpenter ants other than killing them.
Mhm.
I don't set out with it. I mean, my intention is not to take any pleasure in killing these ants, but I don't know what else to do. What are the in that case? What are the karmic repercussions of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say, for one, we should really investigate, as we should really be convinced, not just, I mean, I don't know anything about carpenter ants. I do know, I mean, this sort of thing comes up. They talk, there's different centers that have talked about like termites, and I mean, it can be very, very difficult. Things can, so in one way, of course, if something hasn't happened yet, maybe we're going to build something, or maybe we're moving into some place, then at that stage, it's important to try to think about because I know that maybe more recently there are certain kinds of treated, wood and things like with termites that they won't. You can actually build like the foundation out of treated, wood, and that makes it more difficult that the infestation would begin because they built. But of course, once the home's already built, then they didn't do that, and you're kind of stuck with how that is. And then whether there are like with mice and things, bigger things, there are ways of making it very difficult for them to enter, to really, and it could be it's inconvenient. It's certainly a little bit more expensive, to really think about, what are all of the, because they can get through really, really tiny openings. Their bodies, mice in particular, their bodies are like sponges. They can just sort of collapse and get through things. Their bones are like made out of jello. So, but there are things you can fill cracks with steel, and there are things that you can do. So that is important, broadly speaking. That kind of thinking about things is important, so that if it's possible, you don't end up. And then even if something does happen, then to really research it and really investigate and ask several different other experts in general, like, is this true? Like, I'm hearing this, tell me what's, and it's, and to investigate kind of broadly, because of course a lot of those people are paid to kill things, and so they might just be like, well, yeah, you should just, rather than, well, there's this other thing that's more difficult, a little bit more expensive, less convenient. So I'm just saying in general, like, those are important considerations. But certainly, we live in samsara, and it's an imperfect realm, and so we are from time to time put in difficult circumstances where we've tried all of that, we've asked, we've researched, and it ultimately we're not in a position where it's reasonable to give the house to the insects, and just let them destroy it. Some people, I mean, I'm not saying that that's certainly very reasonable, that we decide that that's not a viable option, and so I would, in general, I would say in that situation, best thing to do is try to consult the highest kind of teacher that you have access to, the most qualified kind of teacher that you have access to, and they could give you maybe the right kind of puja, the right kind of practice or prayers. And sometimes, even I would also even just recommend that in this, in terms of what I was, this researching thing, because there are also examples of times when through that kind of response, the karma actually shifted, it was kind of a weird, like, they just stopped having a problem with whatever it was, because they organized the prayers and the things that were once a karma has started, it's that's kind of hit or miss. It's pretty powerful, antidote that can actually avert or shift an actually ripening karma. It's easier to prevent a karma from ripening than it is to cut off a karma that is ripening. But yeah, I mean, as you're saying, if we do everything that we can do, and that's kind of the situation that we're in, then like you're saying, we see it as a negative action. We see it as, a function. We use it in the same way to fuel our resolve to, because we're in the situation, because we have another ordinary birth, and it's part of being in cyclic existence. So we again think, well, how awful, that even when I drive my car, even when I walk on the grass, even when, I'm constantly harming sentient beings, how terrible, because I haven't achieved enlightenment yet. And so to use that as fuel for our practice. But then I would say, to try to do medicine Buddha puja, to do different things that maybe people might recommend, for the benefit, because since we are necessarily separating bodies and minds, and causing rebirths, we want to make prayers that, that those minds that are now in the intermediate state get a good rebirth. Um, so, I mean, definitely medicine Buddha is what Lama Zopa always, primarily recommended for, times when life was ending. And then there are the 8 prayers, to benefit the deceased. You can, there's mantras and things that you could, affix to the property, to, the Namgyalma mantra, the different, mantra stickers and things you could, put around to kind of bless. Or, again, if you have access to a higher Lama that's in the area, even that person could come and do a blessing, or, something, or could lead something in the space, where to kind of, bless their bodies and minds, prior to the actions that are being taken. So, and then, I mean, of course, we do have to purify that, too, I would say. But, if you feel like you're just, it's just the unavoidable, then I would purify it and move on. You can't beat yourself up over it for months and months, but still, I would say purify it for a couple days, and then, just kind of rest in the knowledge that, you tried your best. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, so we'll leave it there for today. It's a good place to stop. So day 258 is where we will pick it up next on Monday. Yeah. Any final thoughts or questions? All right, so we'll end with dedication. So bring to mind the positive motivation that we established, and think that by listening and contemplating, we've actualized that motivation, created positive energy in the mind, which will ripen in beneficial and supportive ways. So we visualize very strongly the spiritually beneficial and supportive ways that we are offering our practice. All right. I will see everybody on Monday.